All right, let's dive into something pretty fascinating, I think, but maybe a little unsettling for some folks. We're talking about climate change, specifically the impacts in Europe. We're going deep on this report from the European Commission, and it's not just about the science here. It's about getting down to how this is going to affect people and businesses and the environment, like on a real world level.
And what really strikes me about this report is just how broad it is. It doesn't just focus on the environmental changes.
Yeah.
It also looks at the social and economic side of things, and even how different regions will be affected in different ways.
Yeah, this isn't just like some theoretical climate change discussion. This is about real world stuff, like, the Alps, those mountains.
Yeah.
Did you know they provide like 40% of Europe's fresh water? Imagine if snowfall patterns change and that water supply gets disrupted.
Exactly. We could see shortages in places we never thought of before.
It's crazy to think about.
And the report makes these environmental changes very real for us. It talks about how, like, Southern Europe's tourism industry might take a hit in the summer because of, the scorching heat. But then Central Europe could see a boost in tourism year-round.
So it's a mixed bag, huh? Some areas might actually benefit while others face some serious challenges.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, let's break this down a bit. Starting with the environmental impacts, like what's the big picture here?
Well, the report kind of paints this picture of a continent that's like in flux, going through rapid and significant changes. Temperatures are rising, obviously. Extreme weather's becoming more frequent and intense, and precipitation patterns are changing in a big way.
Yeah, and we're not talking about just like 1 or 2 degrees warmer, right?
Right.
I was reading about how severe droughts could become twice as frequent if the global temperature rises 3 degrees C, and that could cost Europe like 40 billion every year.
Exactly. To put that in perspective, that's basically wiping out Croatia's entire GDP every year. It's a pretty huge economic hit. And it's not just droughts, Forest fires. They're becoming more common even in parts of Europe that, never used to have them.
That's a little scary to think about, honestly.
Yeah.
Like places we might know being threatened by wildfires.
It's a changing landscape, literally.
And it's not just on land, right? What about our oceans?
Well, the report goes into ocean acidification. As carbon dioxide levels go up in the atmosphere, the ocean absorbs more of it, and that makes the water more acidic.
Yeah.
And that can be really bad for marine life.
Yeah.
Like from the smallest little plankton all the way up to, entire fish populations and coral reefs.
So this isn't just some environmental problem that's like way out there. It's going to affect what we eat, how coastal communities make their living, even the health of the biggest ecosystem on the planet.
Exactly. The report makes it very clear. Climate change is connected to almost every part of our lives and our societies.
Yeah.
And it talks about the human cost, too.
Right. Let's talk about that human element. It's easy to get lost in the science, but this report really paints a serious picture of the social impact. This isn't about, like, polar bears on melting ice. This is about real people facing real consequences.
For sure. It talks about how there could be more heat-related deaths and illnesses, especially among vulnerable groups, like the elderly or people with pre-existing health conditions.
That makes the challenge feel very real, but it also makes the report's solutions even more urgent.
Yeah.
Is there anything else about the social impact that stood out to you?
Well, one of the findings that I found really striking was the link between climate change and migration. As certain regions become harder to live in, whether it's because of extreme heat, droughts, or rising sea levels, we could see massive migration and displacement. And of course, that's only going to make existing social inequalities worse.
Right, because those who are already struggling are going to be hit the hardest. So what can communities do to protect their most vulnerable members from these impacts?
The report really emphasizes how important education and awareness are. People need to understand how vulnerable they are, what risks they face, so that they can support proactive measures and make changes in their own lives.
So that's where our listeners come in.
Yes, exactly. Knowledge is power, right? The more we understand about climate change, the better we'll be able to demand action from our leaders, make informed choices, and be part of the solution.
And speaking of solutions, let's talk about the economic side of things.
Yeah.
Because the report doesn't just focus on the negative, does it? It also highlights some pretty interesting economic reality.
Right, exactly.
I was surprised to see how much it talks about how businesses can adapt and even find new opportunities in a changing climate. What were some of the things that stood out to you in that section?
Well, it was really fascinating to see how the report emphasizes that businesses need to see climate change not just as a risk, but as a chance to innovate and grow. It
Hmm.
urges companies to assess their risks, invest in things that make them more resilient, and even explore new opportunities in the green economy.
So turning a challenge into an opportunity. Okay, let's unpack that a bit. What kind of specific examples does the report give?
Well, take the energy sector, for example. They're going to face some huge challenges. You've got extreme weather events that could damage infrastructure, and then there's the need to shift away from fossil fuels to renewables.
Right. So will Europe be ready to adapt its energy grid for a hotter future? And can we transition to renewable energy sources fast enough to avoid the worst case scenarios? I mean, that's a big question.
Those are exactly the kinds of questions that the report wants businesses and policymakers to think about. And it's not just energy, of course. Agriculture is going to face a lot of disruption, too. It's essential to Europe's economy and food security.
Yeah, I was reading about how the report predicts big agricultural losses because of droughts, floods, and even the spread of new pests. That sounds like a nightmare for farmers.
It is. And the report specifically says that Southern Europe is going to be hit particularly hard. Now, imagine the ripple effects, right? If agricultural output drops in one region, that can affect food prices and availability across the whole continent, even globally. It just goes to show how interconnected everything is.
Like a domino effect, almost.
Yeah.
One change in one place triggers consequences somewhere else.
Right.
This report really highlights that interconnectedness, doesn't it?
It does, and it goes beyond agriculture. Remember we were talking about tourism earlier?
Yeah.
Well, the report also goes into detail about how climate change is going to reshape that whole industry. Some regions might see tourism decline, while others could actually benefit.
So the impact isn't uniform, right? Some areas might become less appealing for summer vacations because it's just too hot, but other regions could see a surge in tourism during the cooler months.
Exactly. So there's a lot of potential for adaptation and innovation within the tourism industry. And it really underscores the importance of looking at climate change impacts through a regional lens, which is something this report does really well.
Yeah, I'm really interested in exploring those regional differences. It's one thing to talk about climate change in general, but the report seems to highlight the unique ways it's going to play out across the continent.
And that's where it gets really interesting. While the report paints a pretty bleak picture overall, it also stresses that there are regional differences in how vulnerable each area is and how well they're able to adapt. Some regions are going to be hit much harder than others, and some are better prepared to deal with the changes.
So it's like a personalized climate change report for Europe, in a way.
Yeah.
So let's take a little virtual tour of Europe, shall we?
That's good.
Explore these regional realities and really get into the specific challenges and opportunities that each area is facing.
Okay, let's start our journey in a place that's experiencing some of the most dramatic changes, a region that's often seen as like a warning sign for what's to come, the Arctic.
The Arctic. I'm ready to bundle up for this one. What does the report say about that region?
Well, the Arctic is warming up really rapidly, which is leading to melting ice sheets and glaciers. And that has both ecological and geopolitical implications. The report even raises concerns about, increased pressure to drill for oil and gas in this fragile region as it becomes more accessible.
That's worrying. I mean, opening up the Arctic for more resource extraction could actually speed up the very environmental changes we're trying to prevent.
It's a complex situation for sure. On the one hand, we need to protect these fragile ecosystems. They're crucial for regulating the global climate and for biodiversity. But on the other hand, there's a lot of economic and strategic interest in the Arctic as it becomes easier to navigate and its resources become more accessible.
Sounds like a classic case of short-term gains versus long-term sustainability.
Yeah, it is.
What about other parts of Europe? What are some of the other regional hotspots the report talks about?
Well, let's head south to the mountains, like the Alps.
Okay.
They're facing their own set of challenges, mainly due to glacier loss. And as we mentioned earlier, that affects water resources, tourism, and has a whole cascade of impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity.
Yeah, the image of shrinking glaciers is just so powerful, so unsettling.
It is.
It's like a visual representation of the changes that are happening all around us.
Yeah, it is. And one of the things the report points out is that species that live near mountaintops, which are already adapted to harsh conditions, are at risk of going extinct as their habitat shrinks, and they have nowhere higher to go. It's a stark reminder of the biodiversity crisis that we're facing.
That's a sobering thought. We often talk about climate change in abstract terms, but that really brings it home.
It does.
Okay, let's keep moving on our tour. Where to next?
Let's head to the coastlines, where a whole different set of challenges awaits. Coastal areas all across Europe are dealing with rising sea levels and more intense storm surges.
Yeah.
And that puts critical infrastructure and populations at risk.
Yeah, the report mentioned that a third of the EU population lives within 50 kilometers of the coast. That's a lot of people who could be affected by rising seas.
It's a huge number. And the report says that coastal communities are going to need significant investments in things like seawalls, flood barriers, and even managed retreat in some cases to protect themselves.
So these communities are really on the front lines of climate change. What about urban areas? How are Europe's cities being affected?
Well, cities, with all their people and concrete, face some unique challenges. One of the big ones is the urban heat island effect.
Can you explain what that is?
Sure. Basically, urban areas tend to be a lot warmer than the surrounding countryside because of things like dark surfaces absorbing heat, lack of vegetation, and all the human activity. This makes cities especially vulnerable to heat waves, which are only becoming more frequent and intense because of climate change.
So cities are like heat traps. That makes sense, but it also sounds pretty dangerous, especially for people who are already vulnerable.
Exactly. And the report stresses that we need better urban planning. Prioritize green spaces, cool roofs, and other things that can help lessen the heat island effect and make cities more resilient to climate change.
So it's about thinking about climate when we design and build our cities.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
It's a crucial part of adapting.
Mhm.
And it's not just about mitigating risks, it's about making life better for people who live in cities.
Wow, this virtual tour has really been eye-opening, seeing all the different ways climate change is going to impact different parts of Europe. It's a lot to take in, but it's also really fascinating. What are your thoughts as we wrap up this part of our deep dive?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that while the report paints a pretty daunting picture, it also shows us how important it is to recognize that different regions have different needs and that our responses need to be tailored accordingly. What works in the Arctic might not work in the Mediterranean, and what's effective in a city might not work in a rural area.
So it's about understanding the nuances, the specific challenges and opportunities of each region, and recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that while the challenges are big, they're not insurmountable. The report highlights that we have the knowledge, the technology, and the resources to create a future where we're more resilient to climate change.
That's a good note to end on, a message of hope as we continue our deep dive into this report.
Definitely. Yeah, it really is about recognizing we can actually make a difference. The report's big on this idea that individual choices matter. Community efforts, policy changes, they all play a role in building that climate-resilient future.
Sometimes it feels kind of overwhelming, but knowing we're not totally powerless is encouraging, right?
Absolutely. It's about changing our mindset, from apathy or helplessness to actually having some control, feeling empowered. We can all play a part.
I like that. It's not about waiting for someone else to come fix everything. It's about taking charge, doing what we can, even if it seems small.
Exactly. The report even says those small actions add up. They can lead to big changes.
Or think about it.
Reducing your carbon footprint, supporting companies that are actually doing something about climate change, pushing for stronger policies, and even just talking to people, friends and family, about climate change.
Yeah. Those conversations can be tough. I get it. But they're so important, like normalizing these discussions, realizing we're all in this together.
One thing that struck me in the report, they really emphasize that climate change is a global issue, right?
Yeah.
But the solutions, they're often local and regional.
Right. So it's about figuring out what the challenges and opportunities are in our own communities. How can we make our towns, our cities, our regions more resilient? Exactly. Maybe it's supporting local farmers markets so we reduce those food miles. Or pushing for better public transportation, more bike lanes, planting trees, getting involved in environmental projects.
I remember the report had a whole section on the economic side of things, and it wasn't all doom and gloom. There were some pretty interesting points about opportunities for growth and innovation.
That's one of the things that makes this report so compelling. It identifies both the risks and the opportunities for businesses in a world that's being changed by the climate. Like as we move to a low-carbon economy, there's going to be a huge demand for new tech product services.
So it's not just about playing defense and avoiding risk. It's about creating a better future.
Right. A more sustainable future, a more just future, and doing it through innovation and entrepreneurship.
And the report specifically points to the potential for growth in the green economy, right? Like think about renewable energy, energy efficiency, sustainable agriculture, green building materials. The possibilities are pretty much endless. They are. And the businesses that figure out sustainability first, they're going to be the ones who really thrive in this new economy. So it's a win-win. Good for the planet, Good for business.
Now, the report also highlighted those public-private partnerships as being key to dealing with climate change. It's not something governments can handle on their own, is it?
Definitely not.
Hmm.
Governments need to work with businesses, communities, individuals to create an approach that actually works. It's about working together, sharing responsibility.
Breaking down those silos and getting everyone on the same page, this report makes that really clear. It's not just some dry scientific document. It's a call to action.
Right. It's a reminder that we're all in this together. Our actions are what's going to decide the future of Europe and the planet.
And it ends on a pretty hopeful note, doesn't it? Saying we've got the knowledge, the tech, the resources to build a future where we can withstand climate change.
We do, but it also makes it clear that we got to act now. The longer we wait, the harder it gets, the more expensive it gets to deal with climate change.
So let's not waste any more time. Let's use this report as a roadmap.
Yeah.
Let's use it to make changes in our lives, in our communities, at the policy level.
Yeah, let's work together to build that more sustainable, more resilient future for everyone.
One of the things I like about this report is that it doesn't just point out the problems, it points towards solutions. And it's really inspiring.
It is. It's a reminder that we all have to step up, be a part of the solution.
You know, one of the things that really stuck with me was how the report focused on those regional differences. It's easy to talk about climate change in these broad terms, but the impacts are going to be different all across Europe, aren't they?
They are.
Yeah.
We talked about that with our little virtual tour, the challenges in the Arctic. They're totally different from what the Mediterranean's facing. And what works for a coastal city won't work for a rural community.
Exactly. And that's why having this kind of detailed regional analysis is so important, because it lets us figure out the specific needs of different communities and how vulnerable they are. I was also impressed by how the report linked climate change with other issues: social inequality, economic development, public health.
It makes it really clear. Climate change isn't just an environmental issue. It's a societal issue. And we need to remember that.
Yeah, it's about understanding that climate change is going to make existing inequalities worse. And so we need solutions that are fair and just.
I think this report is a fantastic resource for anyone who wants to learn more about how climate change is impacting Europe. And I really encourage our listeners to check it out.
Me too. It's well written, insightful, and actually pretty engaging for such a complex topic. We'll make sure to include a link to the full report in the show notes for anyone who wants to dive in even deeper.
It's worth a read.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot today. This has been a real deep dive into all the complexities of climate change in Europe.
It's been a great conversation, and I hope it's given our listeners a better grasp of the challenges and the opportunities ahead.
I think the key takeaway is that we can't just sit back and do nothing. Climate change is happening right now, and it's going to have a big impact on all of us, on the world around us.
Absolutely. But we're not powerless. We can choose to take action, work together, to build a world that's more sustainable and resilient.
So let's do it. Let's take what we've learned and turn it into action. Let's be the change we want to see in the world.
I like that.
It's been a lot to process, right? I mean, we've talked about everything from melting glaciers to cities becoming heat traps. This report really puts the spotlight on how real climate change is in Europe.
Yeah, but you know what I really appreciate about it? It doesn't just leave you feeling overwhelmed. It gives you knowledge, and hopefully that motivates people to take action.
I agree. It gives us a good foundation to build from. It's got the data, the analysis, even recommendations for moving forward. I was especially surprised by how much it talked about the economic side of things, and it wasn't all bad news.
Right. It actually highlighted all these opportunities for businesses to innovate and thrive in a greener economy. That was pretty encouraging. It's not just about surviving, it's about building something better.
And fairer, too. The focus on social justice in the report really stood out to me. It's a reminder that climate change is going to affect everyone, but it's not going to affect everyone equally. We need to find solutions that actually address those inequalities, not make them worse.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about making sure that the transition to a more sustainable future benefits everyone, not just a select few. And that's where those local and regional solutions become really important. Figuring out how to tailor our approach to the specific needs and challenges of different communities.
And this report does such a good job of that, right? It goes beyond these broad generalizations and really gets into the specifics of different regions. It's not just about climate change in Europe. It's about climate change in, the Alps, the Arctic, coastal towns, big cities.
Exactly. It helps us see that even though this is a global challenge, a lot of the solutions are going to come from our own communities. What can we do right here, right now, to make a difference?
So thinking back on everything we've talked about, What really stuck with you? Was there a particular fact or maybe a recommendation from the report that stood out?
I think it's the emphasis on individual action, working together with collective action, of course. We need strong policies and big changes at a systemic level. But the report reminds us that our everyday choices have an impact too. Like what we eat, how we get around, what businesses we support. It all adds up.
It's about being aware, being engaged, being part of the solution, even if it feels like a small contribution.
And it's about staying curious. This report is just a starting point. I really encourage everyone listening to go check out the full report. We'll put the link in the show notes and just, explore more.
Absolutely. What we talked about today is just scratching the surface. There's so much more to learn, to discuss, and most importantly, to do.
Yeah.
I think the message we want to leave our listeners with is this. Climate change is happening. It's happening now, and it's going to affect all of us. But that doesn't mean we're powerless.
We have the knowledge, the tools, and the ability to come together and build a future where we can handle whatever comes our way. And that starts with understanding the problem and then taking action, both individually and collectively.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and, even more importantly, that it's inspired you to do something.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great conversation.
And until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.